Welcome to the 4th annual Real Organic Virtual Symposium, Break 'em Up, the Chickenization of Organic. Since 2020, when COVID forced us to come together virtually, we've released over 160 interviews of farmers, academics, authors, and movement leaders to address the most pressing issues facing the organic movement. The content of our virtual symposia comes from these awesome podcasts, which you all should listen to weekly for a deeper dive on the issues. The 5 sessions from our first virtual symposium are still available to watch for free on our website, and this is a great way to share our growing movement with your friends. Those sessions on soil science, climate, nutrition, and the formation of the Real Organic Project are still so relevant today. Then in 2022, we covered the lack of enforcement of the organic grazing standards by both certifiers and the National Organic Program. Failing to enforce those standards caused closures in organic dairies across the country and even greater consolidation in the organic dairy industry. Last year's 2023 symposium was about how quickly the term regenerative was becoming greenwashed by big ag, and that billions of dollars went to chemical commodity production under the term climate smart agriculture. These annual virtual symposia have become launching pads for discussion and coordinated action within the organic movement throughout each year. This year, farmers across the country are losing markets faster than ever before, and they're trying to grasp why they're receiving such rock-bottom pricing at the farm gate in spite of record high retail prices on the shelves at grocery stores. Where are all those profits going? And could that pricing structure be related to the consolidation in organic? Is it possible that this consolidation is also related to why the USDA is failing to enforce the organic standards? I hope by the end of this session, you'll understand the link between market consolidation and our loss of democracy. Finally, we'll close with a discussion about what can ignite the much needed change. What can we learn from past successful societal transformations to succeed again, hopefully, when it all feels so hopeless? Most importantly, I really want to thank you all for being here with us today, and I hope you'll stay for this group discussion by clicking on the Zoom link that we'll provide at the end. So we'll see you there.
Food and the food system is kind of a great crossroads for so many of the issues that we contend with. I think for me, I've come to see it was much more central than when I started. And I didn't have such a vision of what we were doing being so central to so many other things. I just, every time I'm pulling the string, it's connected to everything.
The issue in all of this that gets to me is what organic farming offers is the most intimate understanding of the way the natural world works. I mean, when you read some of this research from Holland about the soil microbiome and what's going on around the roots of the plant, and the plant can actually give off exudates that stimulate the bacteria that help make it more resistant to pests. I mean, this is miraculous stuff. This is, holy cow, where did that come from? So all of this is going on, and yet we're being told that hydroponic is organic. People are being denied an understanding of what real organic farming is actually doing.
Yes, I agree. And it was, I would say, inevitable that we would come to this pass in our culture. So it's not a surprise that this battle is going on.
Well, you can't monetize the values I'm talking about, and that everything in the what modern world needs to be monetized. And so the thing you can monetize is calling it organic. I mean, the Coalition for Sustainable Organic saying what we really need is more organic food, so we're just going to call this stuff organic.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, and the thing that makes that possible is all of our supposed one-time friends who have jumped ship. So I don't know if the Organic Trade Association was ever worth anything to organic, but it has no value at all except to the other side. And CCOF has become such a pale shadow, not even a shadow of what it once was, but almost the opposite of what it once was. So how the heck are we going to make these points when there are these organizations that everybody thinks are the gold standards of an organic organization that are fighting against it?
Well, it's interesting. Zephyr, in her book, talks about trade associations as following exactly this game book. And she wasn't talking about the Organic Trade Association. She was talking about this is what happens. Trade associations connect a bunch of small players, and then they work for the big players who fund them. But they do it in the name of everybody, and people are always confused by this, and they're always, I think that's my point. These are almost impersonal struggles that we're having to go through, and yeah, it is about money. I'm curious, you've been around the world a lot, Ellie. You've seen a lot of world organic agriculture, and do other cultures approach this differently? I mean, is America special in the degree to which money trumps all?
Oh, I suspect that's a universal sickness.
So you've got two books, Corruption in America and Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big Ag, Big Tech, and Big Money. And I have to say, I'm curious, just to kick off, that you picked Big Ag instead of, say, Big Oil. What inspired that?
In many ways, agriculture was kind of the canary in the coal mine for what is happening across our entire economic sphere. That the farmers, berry farmers, chicken farmers, commodities farmers across the board really experienced the squeeze pretty early on as the American economic policy shifted in the 1980s and 90s to a top-down concentrated power economic model. We could talk more about that. So there's real lessons and real wisdom in farming from that experience. And also, the problems of concentration in ag, and I think there's a few reasons for that. The problems in concentration in ag and the effects of concentration in ag are well known in American history. The reason the Packer and Stockyards Act, ag-specific anti-monopoly law, was passed in the 1920s, was a real recognition that with perishable goods, producers had a greater risk of being squeezed out and abused and exploited by centralized infrastructure, that there are unique weaknesses in ag that make it easy for centralized distributors to really grab power. I got to tell you, though, just as a matter of communication, it is also easier to talk about ag, even though most people don't know anything about it, but they feel like they do. They eat every day. They're connected to it. There's a deep connection. So that if we are talking about, for instance, what's happening with Uber drivers or what's happening with journalists on Facebook, the metaphor that allows people to feel like they have authority is to tell them the really horrible stories of what has happened over the last 40 years to farmers. The farmers play a really central role in the American imagination.
You think and talk a lot about democracy and
Yes.
how all of this bigness impacts democracy. And for me, this was my critical understanding, Because when I got into this, really, I was still am just a small farmer. And I'm like, what's going on? Why are we seeing this one little bit of the food system that is ours, that we created, the organic movement? Why is the National Organic Program being deformed almost beyond recognition? And I came
Yeah.
up to a failure of democracy because we, the people who created it, the farmers who were part of it, the eaters who were seeking out, none of us wanted this.
No. No. Let me tell you a story which sort of is both a true story, but I think is a parable that helps describe where we are. Same is true in berries, but I'll talk about it. I talk about in my book as chickenization. As of really about 10 years ago, you now have four big players, I think Tyson or Pilgrims, who sit as middlemen between farmers and the market. And if you are in an area, they kind of divide up the country a little like, mob bosses. Here's your region, here's my region. And this is live produce, so it has to be near a processing plant. And after both gobbling up competitors and gobbling up different parts of the supply chain and the distribution chain, they then sit like little kings over the farmers, no longer cooperating in a marketplace, but really governing them. And this is what that means for contract farming, for chicken contract farmers. It means that they look free in the eyes of the law. They count as independent farmers. They count as sort of the American dream of you own your own land and you own your own, you can run your own business any way you want, but they can't use their own feed. They have to use whatever Tyson tells them. They can't use their own lighting system. What time you turn the lights up and down on the chicken. They can't use their own heating system. And then when they take the chickens or get picked up, they are paid different amounts every month in a thing called a tournament system. They're basically pitted against all the other chicken farmers in a contest who can most efficiently produce fat chickens for sale. But it's a contest where you don't actually get to know what your neighbors did. You don't actually get to talk to them. You don't even know what they're paid, and you don't know what you're going to be paid. So you're in this state of real rational paranoia where your how much you get paid goes up and down one week after the next, 1 month after the next, and you don't know if it's because you are in fact winning or losing in this tournament system. And this is where it hits the road on democracy. You know that if you speak up, you might be punished. And in 2010, when Vilsack and Holder came around to do hearings all around the country, a lot of farmers came. They did come and they told their stories.
At the beginning of his administration, there was an antitrust initiative, and there was a series of hearings throughout the Midwest, and maybe not only the Midwest, where both Eric Holder, the Attorney General, and Tom Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture, were building a record, and they were having hearings, and farmers were speaking about their inability to, being black marketed, by a certain packer and only having one place to sell, and concentration in the seed industry, and farmers went way out on a limb to testify. These are people who could get cut off by, Tyson or whoever they were selling to, just like that, and they spoke, and there was a promise that something would happen. And then after the 2010 midterms, where Obama really got shellacked, and Republicans ran on the fact he was anti-business, he stopped. He dropped it all. Just nothing was heard. Pulled back. And you talk to farmers in the Midwest, they all remember that, and they feel like they were stabbed in the back.
But a lot of farmers did that with terror, tears, real fear that telling their stories would lead to them basically going bankrupt. Because, by the way, they've been free to take out the $1 million loan on their chicken house. But that freedom means that they are constantly terrified that their entire world will collapse if they lose their contract. They need that contract. And so there's so many farmers whose tongues were effectively cut out by this system. They were living in a tyrannical system. Besides going to jail, the worst thing for most people is losing their job. But what's worse than losing your job is losing your job and going to debt. Like the duress that these farmers live under is extraordinary. And one of the things Montesquieu said is, who was a real the Baron de Montesquieu, real theorist who influenced the American rebellion against the Brits and setting up a system of distributed power, is that fear, the signs of fear are the signs of tyranny creeping in. When you see farmers start to be scared. And when you see that fear, that is a sign that those farmers, it's really hard to come together collectively, because there'll be some that are brave and admire them. But I talked to a farmer who'd spoken up, and he tells stories of being shut out. Of course, you can't prove it because you're already living like in a panopticon. You're living where you can't know why you're being paid the way you're paid. It's a real state of being governed. And that should be totally antithetical to a democratic system.
So what about democracy? You've written about big food and big ag and big meat and big processing and big stores, big retail.
Well, democracy is threatened by large concentrations of wealth. People knew this and understood this at the turn of the last century, and that's why they wrote the Sherman Antitrust Act and all the other antitrust legislations. They were written not to protect consumers from price fixing, although that's all we hear about anymore. They were written to protect the republic against concentrations of power, that it was totally understood that if corporations got so big, they could push the government around and distort everything. And, the word consumer doesn't appear in the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's about power. It's about politics.
No, we've been borked. So this goes back a very long way. The Congress passed that bill not just because it was good for democracy, but because it was good for capitalism. That monopolies are actually a defect of capitalism, and that all the math of economics fall apart when there's monopoly. And the legislative capture that has gone on is not good for consumers or for producers or for democracy. The thing that we have to understand is, like, I've been to countries that have almost no regulation. I'm guessing you have as well. People who live in those places don't say, we've got it made. There is no regulation. We can put DDT on anything we want. We don't have to worry about this or that. Just, it's a free market. The free market doesn't work if there isn't a understood foundation for how we will be able to be trustworthy in trading with each other. And the desire of a few people to corner the market and to capture the judiciary as they go, I think has been shown over and over again by really smart economists, doesn't end well, and it's not sustainable.
I was sitting in a business school class at Yale, and I realized, the goal of any corporate executive is monopoly. That's where profits are. So you have this fundamental tension between government wanting competitive markets, because that's good for the economy, that's good for innovation, that's good for workers, and businesses not. Their goal is monopoly. So this is a tension. Like, you can't, the story of this era, of this neoliberal era, is winners take all, which is just a blatant lie. And you need competition protection to maintain marketplaces so they can be competitive, or else you'll see robber barons capture the market and break the market.
For me, it's tragic that the United States, which started as a farming country, both if you think of the history of the Native Americans, they were farmers, or you think of the settlers. America was a land of small farmers, and that's what made it a free land.
I think that you said that basically the intensive vegetable production of the Central Valley was almost transplanting the plantation culture of the South, pre-war plantation culture, to the West. Did I get that wrong?
My friend Mark Arax would be better in calling it out, but absolutely, because they started growing cotton for a period of time.
Yeah.
So literally, folks from the King of California will show this. There is historic African American towns in the valley, and African Americans were brought in as labor, a piece of the labor force during those years.
But I wasn't even thinking just about the issue of enslavement. I was thinking about the issue of large large tracts of land being farmed by many, many hands in a very labor-intensive enterprise, with all of that profit being consolidated in very few hands.
It's an appropriate metaphor.
Yeah.
I sometimes toy with the idea of calling it feudalism too.
Yeah.
Because you have a political dynamic with not having people able to vote.
The systems as they are built were built for extraction, not for a thriving rural economy or a thriving population of customers buying highly nutritious food. Feeding the world was never the intention. Let's put it that way. The extraction of wealth from customers who need food, that was definitely part of the idea. And then lowering the standards and the compensation for farmers so that the middle could get more out of the whole set of transactions. That was definitely always part of the problem. It's not conspiracy theory. This is a scientifically verifiable set of facts.
You say really it's the story of these 7 families. And so I'm wondering why you chose to write about the people and not just the businesses.
I love the notion of using robber barons as a frame, because to me, I'm harkening back to a previous moment in American history, but also that phrase implies that these people, mostly men, can shape industries. And I believe the degree of power that they now wield in these different spaces, we need to focus in on that, because that is what's shaping the American food system. Is we know a lot of good people out there trying to push certain reforms, but a few greedy people are holding us back.
Yeah, and you said that they were willing to cross lines that others wouldn't, and so this is really a book about morality.
100%. That is like what something I realized with the robber baron is they're willing to go to ethical degree places, and most people won't go. Most people won't put their animals packed into a metal shed. And this was like lost history I discovered in my research. But after World War II, the U.S. Library of Congress did some studies in Congress of how did fascists happen. And the big finding they had were monopolists. Monopolists finance fascists. Hitler's largest donor was IG Farben. IG Farben's broken up. You might have heard one of its companies today, now known as Bayer Monsanto. There is this, fascists love using the rhetoric of the working person, but they're really for the monopolies.
IG Farben, Standard Oil. Standard Oil, Rockefeller provided the money and the fossil fuels. And IG Farben provided the chemistry. They made explosives using fossil fuels. And then those explosives became fertilizer factories. And they talked about growing food in the air, because they were fixing atmospheric nitrogen. The first chemicals to kill people in concentration camps were the origins of pesticides, Zyklon B. And that's how all of this trend starts. And the tragedy is that most people don't know US corporations were deeply involved. Monsanto had a company with Bayer called Mobay, and now Bayer's bought Monsanto. So in a way, they're back in the original. DuPont used to work with IG Farben. So all of the American companies who today are what I call the poison cartel have their common roots at the time of Hitler's Germany and the war.
They've kind of figured out how to diffuse the blame for any of like the worker welfare issues on the farms, right? Because what they've done is actually, they don't own any of the farms, right? But they sell.
Isn't that incredible?
None of the organic berries in America. So we've definitely got a monopoly here. Let's talk about Driscoll's, their vertical and horizontal integration, and how that's kind of made them just to put their hands up like they don't have any blame for either because their prices are so low, right? Then the whole depression of what happens on the farms then ultimately should run up the chain, but they've been able to diffuse the blame.
They sell 1 in 3 berries in America, but they don't grow a single berry. I mean, Driscoll's is like a really good example of all these different things of a company that just kind of took all these brokenness and put them together to their benefit. I mean, these brothers that took over their family's company after their parents tragically died in an airplane crash in the 80s was they realized quickly the emergence of Walmart, that these supercenters, grocery stores, these national grocery stores want one company to do 4 berries year round. So what they did is they basically view themselves more as like a Silicon Valley company, like an IP, or like a Nike, like a t-shirt company. Nike doesn't make anything it sells, it just contracts out the production. You're paying for the marketing when you buy a Nike t-shirt. That's how Driscoll's is. But Driscoll's, I mean, their brand image, I mean, they write op-eds with the former Democrat governor of California. I don't know. It is, and then there's a whole water issue in California. I mean, berries are incredibly water intensive. They only grow berries on the coast. There's not a lot of rainfall there, so they have to pull from the aquifers. A lot of their berry production in Baja is in an area that only gets 3 inches of rain. I mean, as dry as Death Valley. So they had depleted the aquifers. They built their own desalination plant in the ocean. They can afford it, but the people living there can't.
One of the things that you see in berries, for instance, or other areas, is that the big food, we'll call it big food, will allow some small sector of the market, 3-5%, they'll allow them to exist and point to that as evidence that they aren't in control. We see this with beer too. The beer industry is totally controlled, but they allow for a little corner of artisanal beer, right? But there's an element, a sort of gross element of grace, like they're sort of allowing them to exist, but we know we could crush you if we needed to, right? And that is also not democratic, but the mechanisms are by way of the grocery stores.
Right.
So if Driscoll, the grocery stores need Driscoll because Driscoll's the game in town, right?
Yeah.
They're not gonna have a grocery store without Driscoll berries. People will stop coming. So Driscoll has them over a barrel. And if Driscoll makes clear that you're not going to carry that cooperative's berries, that cooperative's berries aren't going to be carried in that grocery store.
And we actually see that happening for sure. I just want to.
Oh, you do?
Yeah. Because even with Whole Foods, which is the closest to a chain that is an alternative to the other chains, and it's not, but I mean, it's as close as we have. But to sell berries to Whole Foods now, you have to go through the global buyer, right? You can't even sell to the regional warehouse, let alone the store, without permission from the global buyer. How did that deal come about, I wonder? So an interesting thing, Driscoll's themselves have amazingly claimed to be over 70% of the organic berries sold in America. But that was by their own claim. And I think somebody just wasn't thinking very clearly when she said that. That's more than Rockefeller had with Standard Oil when it was deemed illegal.
64%. Yeah.
So that's
right.
clearly a monopoly by any standard. And as I understand it right now on the statutes, that's illegal.
American law does not ban the existence of 70% market share. It intervenes in a few different ways. It doesn't allow for the abuse of that, or what we call monopoly maintenance, basically engaging in behaviors that allow it to protect that power as opposed to just make better berries. And the challenge we have now, Dave, is that because for 40 years, yes, it was Reagan, but absolutely Clinton. Yes, it was Bush, but absolutely Obama. These were just a straight line with small variations on the theme of efficiency is the god. For 40 years, we now have concentrations like the one with Driscoll's that I don't know enough. I haven't investigated. I can't say it's not breaking the law now, but we have allowed this accumulation of power that our law, even aggressively enforced, won't always be able to address. The epitome of the efficiency consumer model of the economy describe monopoly as a company that has the power to unilaterally dictate terms or prices. So I can't speak to Driscoll's, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's true. They're not engaging in price negotiation with a grocery store. They are telling Whole Foods what the price is. It's a dictation. So when you think of monopoly, you can have a monopoly at a much lower level, at 30%, 40%, if you can dictate the terms outside of, as opposed to making it a negotiation effectively.
What I saw, and actually when I first encountered Driscoll's, it wasn't about price. It wasn't even about shelf space. It was about influence on the USDA. And I believe that Driscoll's, it's my personal belief that Driscoll's is the reason that hydroponics are permitted in organic certification. And if Driscoll's wasn't growing hydroponically, I think it would be banned and prohibited. And there was only
Yeah.
one reason why it was permitted, and that was because the second biggest organic produce company in the world told somebody very close to the Secretary of Agriculture that it should be permitted. That's my belief. And that's, I have experiences to support that understanding.
Yeah.
I can't prove it because I would have to like subpoena the person who was close to Vilsack and see if she would tell the truth under oath. But, undoubtedly, I know for sure that there was influence being expressed. And I saw cases where I thought we were actually going to win in the beginning, which surprised me, until the people we were negotiating with realized that Driscoll's was growing hydroponically. And suddenly the conversation changed very much.
So there's this, really fantastical idea in certainly in American history, but in world history, the idea that you can separate the two, that you can have a economic model that looks only at efficiency and doesn't worry about power, and then over here have election law, and ne'er the twain shall meet. Of course the twain meet, right? Of course they do. And as Justice Douglas in the Supreme Court said in 1950, all power tends to form into a government of itself. Mm-hmm. That there is always, that power is the question, right? And that when you have concentrated power, it becomes governing power. And it does so in two ways. One way is direct governing. That was the story with the chickenization story I was telling you. And I know this happens in berry farming, that the berry farmers who are suppliers to Driscoll's some of them are probably Driscoll's employees, but a lot aren't employees, but they're fundamentally governed, and they don't feel like they have free expression or can't be creative, learning, engaging with the soil, they aren't even allowed to learn. This is I know I'm going off on a sidetrack, but it's one of the things that's so sort of maddening is the way in which even the sort of intimate knowledge that farmers have of their land stops being theirs. Mm. And then their ability to care for the land. And so that is one way, that governing way. But the other way you're talking about, which is so important, is that once you gain that power, then your levers over formal governing power become enormous. Some of the levers are the sort of crudest. Funding campaigns. And a lot of times you don't need to, like if you're in a berry district, you probably don't need to fund campaigns. You just need the politicians to know that you could fund campaigns to destroy them. A lot of the money power in politics is latent. It's not used. It's just sitting there as a fearsome bear around the corner. And politicians do not want to unleash that bear. Then you have lobbying power, and lobbying power is enormous. And it happens in the direct way where there's the explicit lobbying meetings, but a lot of lobbying is what we call shadow lobbying. It's not on particular bills, it's insinuating yourself in the culture, it's reports, friendships, cocktail hours. And then companies like Driscoll's have another source of power, which is just the fear that if you pull the plug on them, that if you hurt them, you'll hurt the economy, or you'll hurt the part of the economy you're responsible for. So the too big to fail threat was so obvious in the banking crisis of 2008. They said, you can't regulate us in certain ways. We get that you may regulate us in a few ways, but if you destroy us, the whole thing goes up. Basically, we're holding you hostage. You aim at me, you aim at the country. Right?
Yes.
And this, I believe, is, without knowing the particular claim you make, that there's no doubt that Driscoll's has that kind of power.
In case you don't know, there are 1,200 lobbyists on the Hill that work for the agriculture and food processing industry. They spend about $350 million a year on forming opinions in Washington, and that's more than the defense industry. So don't underestimate their power. And they would be very happy to have a lot of variations on this, to fool you to think that natural included GMO food. They would like to change a lot of things, water down this brand, and the consumer will be completely confused. As you know, people already are confused about, well, is it sustainable, organic, natural? What should I buy at the store? So this is critically important.
But then you also have, you've got the big giant multinational businesses that are out here that they want it their way, man. That's a fact. They got no time for John Tester. They don't. And quite frankly, so they're going to do whatever they can do to make sure that marketplace, that they control 85% of the meat in this country, or the world, I should say. They like that because you control food, you control people. And if you got competition, capitalism works. If you don't, it doesn't work.
Why are farm workers poor? Why are they treated so very badly?
The reason why in the United States agriculture we are so poor, it's the obvious reason of stagnation of wages. On the top of the agricultural industry has always been worried only about the quality of the product. Was used to basically ask for the lowest possible price. And I'm talking about the retail food industry in this country, whether it is fast food, supermarkets, food providers. That type of power, the power of their purchasing order, was being used to ask for a certain size of tomato, a certain state of maturity, but overall, the lowest possible price to maximize profit.
That was the easiest way for them to maximize profit,
Exactly.
was to push down the labor
exactly.
and the production.
That's the only place where they had the power to actually keep prices themselves that they pay stagnant.
Exactly. So when you look at the price of the bucket, like a bucket that was being paid 40 to 45 cents.
That's a bucket of tomatoes, like a bushel.
Yes,
32 pounds of tomatoes.
So 32 pounds at that price, you would have to pick nearly 2.5 tons of tomatoes just to make the equivalent of minimum wage. 30 years of that same wage is no coincidence. If you look at it as an isolated thing and don't think about what's on top of the agricultural industry, you might not get to that point. But as a community, we were looking for those types of connections.
Yes.
And we got to the point of understanding that the extreme poverty that we as workers were living with was connected to the extreme wealth at the other end of the spectrum.
How much of America's food gets bought at a Walmart?
Depending on the estimate, at this point, it's about either 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 grocery dollars are spent at Walmart in the U.S. And I mean, that's a staggering number for one company to control that big of a slice of Americans' grocery purchasing. A lot of people who are low income are getting their food at Walmart, and it is the best source in their area for affordable food. And I think it's complicated for a couple reasons. What was there before the Walmart? So, maybe now it's the source of affordable food, but what was destroyed before? What happened? Why is it the only source of affordable food in that region? And some of the very complicated factors leading up to Walmart being kind of that sole source, might include small grocers being run out of business and small farms that were selling to their communities not being able to hang on anymore because they can't compete. And so that's one piece of it. And that's we could talk about that one aspect for a long time. And then the other big piece is, the reason that Walmart is able to sell at those prices is not because they're just nicer than every other grocery store, right? Like you and I know that in order to drive prices down, you have to cut somewhere, especially if at the end of the day, you're also making record profits.
So as a supplier, if my little farm was going to try and sell to Walmart, what do you think that would look like?
I mean, based on my reporting, there really aren't any small farms selling to Walmart. They tried to buy from small farms, but they then applied the same system that they apply to their large suppliers, which is they say, okay, we'll buy from you at this price, but then we're going to keep lowering the price we're going to pay to you. And, year after year, these small farms are trying to scale up in order to meet their volume demands. They're trying to make it work at the lower prices just so that they can get this big contract. And at the end of the day, it falls apart because it costs more. There's a mismatch of scale, basically. These small farms are operating on really, really thin margins, and they can't sell at Walmart's prices and make a profit. They just can't. They can't a lot of times cover their costs. They're selling for less than the cost of production.
Walmart has a rule with its suppliers that no more than 30% of its business can come from Walmart. And I didn't really get that at first, to be honest with you. I asked some people I know in the grocery industry, why would Walmart do that? And they go, Austin, it's for supply chain management. They realize they're such a vulture that if a company gets to sell more than 30% of their stuff to Walmart, it puts them at risk for going bankrupt. Because they basically, most suppliers selling to Walmart, they sell at cost, it's a money loss, what have you. They need to basically sell 70% elsewhere to make up for Walmart, which, you know what I mean, just skews the playing field more. And I just like, what a great demonstration of market power.
The purchasing power they have, especially over those 30 years of stagnant wages, the purchasing power that they accumulated. When you think about it, this was 50 years ago, right? At this point, when you start counting those 30 years. Walmart was just a few stores 50 years ago, which is impossible to believe at this point, but it was just a few stores, right? McDonald's, the same thing. It was a chain that was just starting. All those things, and they didn't have the purchasing power of 10,000 restaurants that they could wield. And when you look at markets, really, all they are is a network of negotiations, right, from the top to the bottom. And in negotiation, it's very simple. You know, power is in size. The bigger you are, the more powerful you are, the more you can dictate the end result of the negotiation. And I think most farmers in this country would call themselves price takers, not price setters, right? And they're not just price takers for what they sell, but for what they buy as well. You know, you can't tell Exxon that I'm going to pay you less for diesel next year, right? You can't do that with John Deere. You can't do that with a bank. You can't do that with anybody that you buy the inputs, from to produce. The one person you're bigger than, though, is the individual worker. And so as a farmer, it wasn't even necessarily intentional. It was just a factual sort of exploitation that was a way of staying afloat, right? And that what that meant was over those 30 years of completely stagnant piece rates for a bucket of 32 pounds of tomatoes, people's lives each year got cheapened, got worsened, got diminished.
Walmart is still, I would say, the center of gravity in the grocery industry. They have monopoly control of hundreds of metro areas, mostly smaller towns, smaller cities, primarily in the middle of the country, but also drifting out into the upper Midwest and the Southwest and the Southeast. Walmart has a deleterious impact on every aspect of the grocery industry. When we talk about pricing, you may not be shopping at a competitor to Walmart, but your grocery store competes with somebody who competes with Walmart, guaranteed. And what that means is there's price pressure on what their retail prices are. There's pressure on their wages downward, because Walmart, even though they've raised wages, still does not pay a living wage in any metro. Living wages in most metro areas are north of 50 grand. How many grocery stores can say that we, on average, pay our clerks $25 an hour, 40 hours a week, 52 weeks of the year? Probably not too many. That's why there's 75% food insecurity in the grocery industry. It was a study that came out about Kroger. So all these pressures come, though, from Walmart. And so we talk about the Kroger-Albertsons merger. They admitted it, like, we need to merge so we can compete with Walmart. They're not lying. That's probably the only thing they're not lying about. But the problem starts with Walmart and how Walmart has gutted the economies of hundreds of towns and cities. It's gutted food systems. You need to just think of the suction effect of how much Walmart supply chains are buying from around the world. They're a huge customer of just about every major brand and many smaller brands, many small and mid-sized farms, and particularly larger farms. Walmart is just a huge presence in the grocery industry, and you can't have any conversation about grocery unless you give Walmart 30% of the time for 30 cents of the dollar.
Okay, I'm Joe Citizen, and you just told me that there's this tremendous consolidation into a small number of hands. Why should I care?
Well, you should probably care because you're paying 30 to 40% more for groceries this year than you were in 2019. There's this website, Retail Watchers, somebody turned me onto it, where you could look at receipts. People are documenting receipts from 2019 to 2022. And in some retailers like Walmart, their Great Value brand, which is the country's largest private label brand, prices were up 30 or 40% on many items. Albertsons, some of their private label items like Signature and Lucerne, prices were up 70 to 100% in that 3-year time frame. So when you hear the media narrative saying, oh, well, CPI has slowed down to 3.6% or whatever, 4%, that is the price you're paying today on the same item on average as last year. But that doesn't measure the damage to your wallet that has been inflicted over the last 3 or 4 years, or the fact that the way that CPI translates into CPG, consumer packaged goods. Consumer packaged goods companies' rate of price increases has continually outpaced the rate of inflation every quarter since the beginning of the pandemic, sometimes 2x the rate of inflation. And this was a study done by Nielsen IQ, which is, for those of us in the grocery industry, the largest syndicated data. Like, this is like, for us, it's like gospel. CPG companies have at times been 50 to 75% higher in their rate of price increase than the consumer price index, which is the quote, measure of inflation. So when you ask me why consolidation is bad, what are you paying for groceries?
Why should we have massive subsidies for the world's richest family? They make like, if you're not viable, like a lot of these programs were created for people when they were in dire needs, like the moment. Now they're for perpetual programs. You know what I mean? You shouldn't be working a full-time job and require food assistance. But that's where we are. It's a welfare subsidy for the barons because they don't want to pay them their living wage. And I document in the book, anytime there's labor union activity at Walmart, it turns out they need to shut the Walmart store down for plumbing issues.
That's one of my favorite walkaways from this, actually, and it's like a quote that you said something about how that they're not self-made, these barons, that the system made them.
Yes.
Right? So these are systemic changes that we really need, and
we can unmake them. We can choose to unmake them. It doesn't have to be this way. Like these barons can only be barons because of the massive subsidies.
My favorite recent fact of all this year is the fact that a cow, a beef, an animal can be raised, can get as many calories, as much nutrition from 1 acre of well-managed pasture as they can from an acre of corn. That is a totally stunning fact, environmentally, nutritionally, in every way, because that acre of corn took a huge amount of energy to plant. You had this hybrid corn development, then you plow it, and then you plant it, and then you fertilize it, and you harvest it, and then you send it west to feedlot. All that is producing CO2 and using energy, and that field is doing none of that.
So have you got a guess about why it is that we're growing so much corn instead of?
Of course, it's subsidized.
It's subsidized.
It's what
by
the
us.
government. There are years. When I was teaching every year, and we would collect there are years when the farmers make not a cent from selling their corn, and all the payments they get are government payments. And Frankie LePay's book years and years ago, Diet for a Small Planet, was about how they had to figure out what to do with all that extra corn, and that's how they started feeding cattle in feedlots, because it was one of the ways they could use all that corn and concentrate the feeding and, efficiency, make it more efficient, as they say. Yeah. So great word we love to use.
Efficiency, yeah. Efficiency towards what?
Well, what it tends to always mean when you say that something's more efficient is it uses less labor. Yeah. So it's a way of putting people out of work.
Yeah, right. So you're describing an insane food system in which we're paying people to do the wrong thing. We, the taxpayers, are paying people to do the wrong thing.
And very concentrated power. What, 2, 3, or 4 seed and fertilizer companies, 4 to 6 processors, huge processing, food manufacturers, as they're called. They don't manufacture food, they just alter it. But and they swing so much weight. It's really very depressing, because people ask me if I think things have improved in the 50 years. 50 years ago, I wrote a thing in the Feeding Web, which came out in 1978. I had a whole chapter about the food supply and this absurd food supply with all these products in it that people shouldn't be eating, because it was a shock to me. I was born in 1928. There were 800 items in the supermarket. 800. There are now, 60,000, 50,000? God didn't make that many new foods in the interim,
And it feels to people like now they have far more choices.
Oh, I know the choice.
But I actually think that they have less choices.
They do have less choices.
And so we looked at some of this data to see, okay, well, how many, companies, for instance, are making our breakfast cereals, or how many companies are producing our bread or our milk or whatever. And we found that we looked at about 55 different categories. And we found that on average, the top 4 companies controlled about 60% of the market. And that's a problem. So when we talk about antitrust and we talk about corporate consolidation, anything above like 50 to 60% is problematic, right? That's not a competitive marketplace. But there were some categories, like we looked at dip sales, that were over 90% controlled by just one company. So there is rapid consolidation across the supermarket shelves. But this is something that we don't necessarily notice because, like I mentioned, you go in and there's, tons of different varieties of everything you buy. Bread is one example. If you go to the grocery store, maybe you're trying to choose between, Nature's Own or Dave's Killer Bread or other types of bread that maybe look like they're a healthier choice. Well, both of those are actually owned by the producers of Wonder Bread, a company called Flower Foods that most of us have not even heard of.
And so I left Whole Foods in 2016. I was pushed out in a wave of layoffs that happened in that era, where you saw a lot of people coming in from larger companies, Target, Walmart, Home Depot, etc.
And it was moving into that period, your period, when Whole Foods was working pretty hard to bring in local producers. And frankly, most stores were. They were following the lead of Whole Foods. So it was interesting to see that, Hannaford sent a film crew here, and so did Shaw's. And, everybody wanted to show that they were getting local, and Stop and Shop loved us. That's all gone. That's all gone. None of those people are interested in local. They certainly aren't interested in regional. They're pretty much national buyers now.
The continued consolidation of the industry, which we could talk about, but also the fact that they're not getting as much public pressure as they were 15, 20 years ago. And I also think there was a generation of us in the industry who were pushing for that, who, just felt like we could do better, but also we were sort of bored by the status quo. And, I don't mean to be flippant about it, because the status quo is also devastating to the environment, unfair to workers, and not really good for the consumer either. And so I think there was a movement afoot in the industry that I think has really tailed off at retail. I think for a while, there were enough of us in retail who were pushing the envelope to make retailers, I'd say, a leader, because I think some retailers have always been leaders, like, a lot of independents and cooperatives. But to get even the larger organizations to play more fairly and at least try to be a bit more sustainable, which was really difficult with these internal cultures and their profitability needs and just general conservatism towards, any kind of progressive food system change. And I think that's really gone now. You see a lot of PR, a lot of greenwash, but not a lot of substantive actions. You say, we sell a lot more healthy food, we sell a lot more fresh food, and then pictures of random commodity growers. And there's not really a substantive effort, which is something I detailed in a recent interview I did for The Guardian about, certain on shelf attributes like local, and just how sort of commodified and abstract that's become. It has real no meaning. Not to say that it had a meaning when I was working there. I'm saying that we were trying to assign it something substantive through the work we were doing with suppliers, with supply chains, really rebuilding them from scratch, primarily as to change the trajectory of the American food system. I don't say that lightly, because a lot of us put a lot of time and effort and blood and sweat into that, and weren't always successful. And I would say right now we're seeing the fact that on an institutional level, a lot of us weren't successful because the institutions themselves refused to change after a certain point. And we saw a big reaction, particularly driven by Wall Street profitability needs, but also, just a general malaise, like, we can't really make much more money on this, so why are we trying so hard? We're not getting that much pushback from customers, and we could just give them just enough to keep them happy and quiet, and we could do a little PR to keep the activists off our back. So just in general, I'm a lot more skeptical about the role that retailers can play in improving the food system right now.
It was not just greenwash. I mean, I saw it, that the chains in the Northeast were absolutely scrambling to buy local, to open their doors to local suppliers. And I thought, wow, things are looking up. This is great to see that the food system is changing. And I think you just suggested that change was primarily coming from the people who are working within the system, within the companies, that there was a group of people, fairly activist, motivated people, who said, we can do better. Let's buy local food from farmers, as opposed to just this pressure from eaters, from consumers, to say, this is what we want. You're saying that actually this change was being led by a fairly enlightened group of mid-level managers within these companies.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of us came up through the organizations. We started out as clerks, and we started out in food co-ops or farmers markets. I've worked on farms. I've done, stuff outside of traditional retail. And then we had folks who came from traditional retail, bigger grocers are like, ugh, I hated that. I want to do something different.
Why was the corporation stepping away from this velvet revolution, this group of people who were bringing something?
The Havel thing there.
Yeah.
I think there was a lot of things changing at Whole Foods. There was a lot more demands from shareholders for profitability, like bottom line, EBITDA as a publicly traded company. They were demanding tighter G&A, general administrative spending. They were demanding that the company labor budgets would be lower. At the time, in the early 2000s, Whole Foods was spending 19%, 19 cents of every dollar on labor, which is about 5 to 6 points in most other retailers. It's probably 2x what Walmart spends or Trader Joe's spends. And because of those financial pressures, those pressures on margins that were driven by the fact that mainstream retailers, Kroger, Walmart, Albertsons, Trader Joe's, Stop and Shop, had jumped in headfirst into organic foods, but plugged them into their supply chains, with their supplier relationships and their philosophies, which were much more about efficiencies and economies of scale. When you have a company that has 2,000 stores, it's a very different economy of scale than a company with 2 stores or 20 stores or 200 or 500 stores. So it's different types of supplier relationships, different suppliers. They pushed organic certifiers to conform to their needs. For instance, you saw a lot more hydroponic products coming in, hydroponically grown produce. Those are meant to service the big channel retailers. You saw organic dairy that was being sourced from CAFOs as opposed to small family farms. That milk was going towards these efficiencies, these economies of scale at these larger retailers. What this also meant was that it pushed the price threshold down. So not just for the consumer expected a cheaper price to get milk at Walmart versus milk at Whole Foods or Wild Oats or milk at the River Valley Co-op. So they expected that. But that shit flows downhill.
Farms produce what people eat. Farms produce what people will buy. If what people buy comes in packages or has run at any point in its cycle through the maw of those 4 big food companies, there is no legitimate place for farms like ours. There is no way that our farm could profitably sell what we grow into the industrial food system. So, if you don't want to buy what farms like ours produce and make it the mainstay of your diet and not just the garnish, we simply won't exist. What will flow in to fill our place? It's not too much of a stretch to say that almost all the good ground in America is in corn and beans, right? The ruthlessly efficient model of industrial agriculture is spray, plant, spray, harvest, repeat at increasingly enormous scale. There are no people on those vast acres. There are no communities, just a few very large and expensive machines. Meanwhile, the biggest chunk of the American food dollar goes for processed foods and sweets. So it's pretty simple. If what we choose to eat is narrow, our agricultural landscape will be narrow. When I think of the sameness of those fields that stretch for miles, the narrow sameness of our food choices, I get the same feeling that I get when I see the soulless sameness of American strip malls or replicated tracts of housing, or the aisle of a big box store that's the same in Arkansas as it is in Alaska. And I know that we have to muster an effort to change it.
And this is where the chefs come in. I mean, the chefs have been the best promoters of good farming. When Alice Waters starts, telling her story about food, which is great food begins with great farming, and Dan Barber's telling the same story, and that makes a difference. I mean, the chefs took some of the light of their glamour that they had, and they reflected it on farmers in a way that was really profound, and I think contributed to the rise in the prestige of farming and certainly the morale of farmers, and but also to the consumer, a signal that this is different food, and it's the experience is worth something more than the supermarket product.
So I just had a really interesting interview with Joan Gussow, and I asked her, we were talking about the organic Twinkie debate and whether you could have an organic Twinkie. And she said no, she didn't think so. And it was because it's a question not that you couldn't have organic ingredients, but when you put those ingredients together to make a super processed food, that is not the point of organic. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's an age-old thing. You're right. She started that. She was the first to pose that question, wasn't she? It's sad that is there such a thing as an organic Twinkie, by the way?
No.
There is not.
No.
But it was a
It was a hypothetical.
intellectual exercise.
Yeah,
Okay.
and yeah, I mean there are organic gummy bears now.
There are.
There are.
So okay, so it's not C. It's all these things that are hypotheticals that you would think no crazy person would ever buy such a thing is now reality. In the same way they would think, why would you, highly process peas to imitate a burger and say you're saving the world? That would be impossible. And yet here we are.
And here we are.
So, the best thing that Joan ever said was to me she said a lot of great things. The best thing she said, and I think it's apropos to what's happening today. You and I had a conversation about the billions of dollars going into replacing the cow from the face of the earth and replacing farmers, and money that's flowing into hydroponics and stacked up greenhouses and the rest. She in I think it was the 70s said, when everyone was turning to margarine, including my family, so it was very personal to me, butter was out. You could not eat butter. Margarine was a technological advance that made butter seem anachronistic and unhealthful, and margarine was everything that the scientists could put together to make you healthy and not miss butter and et cetera. And she said, I don't eat margarine because I trust cows more than scientists. And I thought that's apropos to exactly what we're facing today, or dealing with today, which is technological, advanced science, and the pursuit of capitalism, which I'm not anti-capitalist. This is not an anti-capitalist statement. It's just a statement of fact that very few investments are geared towards biology, and unfortunately, biology is what makes food taste great and what makes the world a healthier world to live in. And I think we will wake up and realize that in the same way that we woke up and realized that margarine is not the future of butter.
In order to get the agriculture that we believe is sane and that we believe will feed us and make us healthy, you're saying we need to change the culture.
The food culture.
The culture has to change, whether we change it or not. There has to be an evolution.
Totally.
Do you think?
It reminds me of all the conferences I went to, Dave, organic conferences. I never, ever, in one of them, years and years, I never, ever experienced anybody talking about food restaurant chefs. They talked about food in the sense of farming, but I'm talking about food in the sense of gastronomy. No gastronomy. Gastronomy was foreign. I've been to an equal amount of gastronomic conferences around the world over 30 years of my career. Never once was there discussion and in-depth look at agriculture and biological systems and organic systems. Never. It's as if those two worlds run on these like crazy parallel lines. It's nuts.
Because we've been so addicted to sort of those fast food values, and we think that we're getting cheaper food, and and I want what I want when I want it, and I can get what I want, and it's okay to eat in my car, and all of these ideas have really put this country against the small farmer, the organic people, the local people who care. And I just feel like if we don't go into the public schools with this idea, and we could go into the schools tomorrow. I mean, when we have a war on, we can make big unilateral decisions, and we have climate change upon us. We have a health crisis, and we could say to the USDA, let us fund the people who are taking care of the land in every state of this country, and let us buy food for schools directly from those people. And maybe there's an added financial incentive to do it. But I can't imagine that under these circumstances that we couldn't really dictate this, like the mayor of Copenhagen, for example, and the mayor in Paris decided that all the food for the Paris schools should come within 250 miles of Paris. Or is it 150? I'm not sure. And she wanted it all regenerative, organic. And it's only been a year, and they're 2/3 to doing it.
Yeah, yeah. The So here is the place where we run up against
Money.
But
it's only about money.
But big money, concentrated money.
It's
not just money everywhere. It's money
yes.
concentrated in a few places.
Yes.
And it means that it's a challenge to do what we want to do, isn't it?
It is a challenge, but it's absolutely necessary for climate, for health, for community, for understanding the value of food to our lives. And we can't do without it. And to see how many people are hungry. How could this be in this country? How could it be? How could it be in any country? That there's something deeply wrong with the way the industrial food system has.
There's a question that I run into a lot where groups that I work with, some of them want to work with big industry because they feel, well, big industry controls our world. So we want a seat at the table. We want a place where our voice can be heard. And if we can make them a little better, isn't that a good thing? And well, tell me what you think about that.
Well, I think we're at a place where we have to go all the way. I mean, how could we not want to do everything we could do to prevent further destruction of the atmosphere?
Yeah, our
I mean, how could we not? We're told by the United Nations that 2030, we're not going to be able to make change after that.
If we learn, if we become informed, if we're talking, are we creating change?
Not necessarily.
Not
the
necessarily.
Talk is often the precursor to action, right? You you hear, you reflect, you understand, you move, but not always. Talking is not a substitute for action.
Yeah. So let's talk about change for a minute. You talked about it's not enough to take organic muffins to your neighbor, right? And that we really need change on a different level. That it's wonderful to be kind to your neighbor. It's wonderful that the muffins are organic. But what is the thing that we need that goes beyond that?
It's a good question. I mean, I think what you're getting at there is the difference between like individual choice and societal transformation. And it's not just the sum of individual actions that make societal transformation. We're in a society that has institutions and laws and budgets. And so changing those rules of play are really important. So I'll give an example, right? Like if we use the muffin way of being to try to end slavery, where one at a time, each abolitionist neighbor reached out to each slaveholding neighbor and tried to convince them via organic muffins, right? That like we really should maybe not hold human beings as chattel, and maybe convinced a few people to free the enslaved Africa, but some still did it. And, we'd be in a really different world. What actually needed to happen was that legislation needed to be passed to say, this is unacceptable. This is no longer part of our social contract as America. It's unacceptable. And even if you feel like, as the so-called master, self-proclaimed master, that you should have the right to do this, we are telling you that you do not. And that there are actually consequences for that will be enforced. And I think getting the political will to make that policy change did involve a lot of individual conversations and kindness to your neighbor and convincing people, because you have to get to a tipping point. But we mark the success of the tipping point by a change in institutions and laws. And so I think we need, as an example, farm workers in this country do not have the right to overtime pay, a day off in 7, the right to collectively bargain, and still are subjected to wage theft and abuses that there's not an enforcement agency to protect. I don't want to go around and convince the doles of the world that they need to be nicer. I would like our government to pass laws that give farm workers equal rights and have an enforcement agency that sees that those rights are carried out. So that's what I'm talking about. It's like muffins might be a step, but ultimately we need to change our institutions.
Thoreau and King are two of the most famous boycotters, right? And in this sense, I'm using boycott broadly, including civil disobedience. But the way in which they talk about it is really strikingly different. For Thoreau, who had an influence on and King. They're not living in separate worlds. King wasn't critiquing Thoreau. I think took real inspiration. For Thoreau, a large part of his own discussion was appealing to or describing his own unwillingness to be part of a inhumane system, slavery. And it's extremely appealing and moving. King, by contrast, puts the boycott as part of a strategic effort and puts civil disobedience as part of a strategic effort. And in his letter to the Birmingham jail, he lays out the steps. First, negotiate and purify, the boycott, purify not meaning like a weird kind of purification, but preparing for the conflict, but he is very much part of a strategic effort to change policy, not to feel good about himself. And I want to feel good about myself.
To change policy rather than just to feel good about himself. Just
rather than just to feel good, just to change policy rather than. And so the real goal, the real moral goal, and King talks about this morality beautifully, is not, he doesn't put it in the negative, I'll put it in the positive. It's just to change people's lives. It is to live in a just society, not just to live as a just person.
In Break 'em Up, you were saying this idea of, protesting, using your wallet, voting with your wallet, ultimately was a little bit of a sideshow, and that we needed to move more directly to the cause of the problem, which was this concentration of power. And I agree. I agree with you. I thought it took me a while to get there, and I'm like, oh my God, we're missing the point here. The reason that this is happening and that we're working is a breakdown of democracy. And the reason there's a breakdown of democracy is certain large corporations have way too much power. But what was interesting about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, they did the same thing for 10 years. They were organizing protests against the farms where these terribly abused farm workers were working, some of them in literal slavery. And they weren't getting anywhere. And they had a new idea. And for 4 years, they traveled around the country organizing people to protest against Taco Bell. They picked one company. And they said, let's get it that Taco Bell no longer participates in a system that is supported by slavery in America, where people are locked up in shipping containers at night, and in which people are sexually abused, in which wages are stolen. And they went to all these churches and colleges, and they actually won. And after 4 years, Taco Bell signed the contract, and that was the first domino. And now they've got, I think, 12 major corporations, including Walmart, including Whole Foods, who are part of this. And it has really, as my understanding, transformed the lives of the people working in the tomato fields in Florida.
I'm a farm worker. Since I was 11 years old in Mexico, I was working in the fields, and I was going to middle school. So whenever there was a job in the evenings, weekends, there was no vacation because there was the need to survive. And I came to Immokalee because I heard about the work. I heard that if you were working in the fields back then, you could earn, if you were the slowest worker, you could earn like $70. But if you were fast, you could earn more than $100. And back then, that seemed like a pretty decent amount of money. Yeah. So I came to work, and when I arrived, I encountered that all of those were lies. We were working, a group of us, myself, were working harvesting tomatoes. The boss stole our wages, and he got mad that we didn't want to continue like that. So we didn't have a job the next day. We didn't have a home, money. We didn't know anybody. That was our welcoming to Immokalee. In total, there was like 2 weeks probably where we didn't have a place to go. So in that desperate search for a job and for a home to rent, we met these workers that were coming back from Chicago at the time, that were part of the second case of modern-day slavery, the Cuello case, that the Coalition of Immokalee Workers helped to bring to justice. So it was them that introduced us to the work of the CIW, that told us about how they were bought and sold, and how they escaped and got help. They were finally free.
You're talking about 20 years ago that there was slavery in Florida?
Well, I'm talking about how, when I arrived, there was a second case of modern day slavery, but there's been many other cases. It was not something that happened.
It wasn't just a one-off thing. It was something
No,
that was
no.
part of the system.
It's something that was happening almost every year.
Yeah.
And continues to happen, outside of the protections of the Fair Food Program, which we will touch upon. There was an article that came up on a magazine, The Packer, where Taco Bell was describing the connection they had with some of the farms that we work with. And based on that, we understood, that connection, we need to talk to Taco Bell. We need to let them know what's going on. And I'm sure that they are going to want to do something about it when they know that there's all of these abuses going on in this industry, and that they could use their power to try to help us solve all of this. But we were wrong. They were not ready to hear something like that. So it took several letters. And finally, after understanding that the market was not going to move on its own, we decided that we needed to create an alliance with consumers across the country to ask them to sit at the table with us.
So critically, it wasn't actually that you went and convinced Taco Bell or Walmart.
Absolutely not. Because again, markets are negotiations, right? And the market, we all think as consumers that Walmart is the biggest buyer in the world. And in fact, they are the biggest individual buyer in the world of most things, right? But Walmart sells too. So the biggest buyer is actually the consumers who have all the purchasing power in the world, right? But consumers, as a rule, act individually. They don't act collectively. They don't purchase in any kind of collective way. What we did was to say, we need you as consumers to tell Taco Bell that you won't buy from Taco Bell if they don't demand human rights compliance from their suppliers, where we work, where the farm workers in Immokalee work. It was an idea that had, obviously boycotts had happened before, but the end result that we were looking for was actually a legally binding agreement with Taco Bell, between Taco Bell and the farm worker community, that they would only buy from growers who protect their workers' rights. And that was new. That was entirely novel. That the same dynamics that took us a couple of decades to understand exist everywhere. That chain of power that creates poverty and abuse in its normal operation can actually be changed. It can actually be reversed, and it can help diminish the poverty of the people at the bottom of the supply chain and help end the abuse if properly harnessed, properly motivated. And that's happening. That process of harnessing the purchasing power of these major brands is happening in supply chains around the globe today.
At no great damage to either the farms or the multinational corporations.
On the contrary, to their benefit. Because it is damaging. Take Kroger. Kroger so far is a company that's refused to join the Fair Food Program. It's a massive company. Kroger has been connected over the past 4 years to 3 major forced labor operations by the U.S. Department of Labor, by the Justice Department. For some reason, Kroger seems to think that that's okay. That 3 major forced labor operations being connected over the course of 4 years is an acceptable outcome. And I can't understand how that's the case. Even less is it possible to defend that position when you consider that there is a program, the Fair Food Program, which is proven, and every single law enforcement agency in the country stands by this, to be the only certification program capable of stopping, of preventing forced labor. So there's a solution, there's a problem, and yet companies like Kroger still refuse to actually adopt the solution for whatever reason. So there is a lot more work to be done, but that can't be good for Kroger. Kroger wants to acquire Albertsons. The issue of their connection to the sort of supply chain slavery problem is coming up in those conversations, right? That's not good for Kroger. That's something that they should actually solve and put behind them.
Why do you think that those institutions are so afraid of thinking differently and trying for what are obvious problems, whatever the solutions might be? Obviously there are problems. Why are they so reluctant to change?
It's because of the behavior, and this we've learned historically. We've learned it through system science and what are called wicked problems. Human organizations, and they're the only way we can manage at scale, when we form them take on a life of their own. And no human organization is actually a human. And no human organization behaves like a human. So once we form our organizations and we can have the most perfect people in the world in them, that doesn't matter. They have ceased to be people, they're now an organization. Now, organizations take on a life of their own. They defend the beliefs of society in which they are formed, and they have what are called wicked problems, which means they're almost impossible to solve. I mean, let's just look at your organization, Real Organic. I believe 1,000% in what you're doing. I think you're one of the brightest thinkers I know in that field, amongst some other very good people. How are you doing? What progress are you making? So Albert Howard, about 100 years ago, before I was born, was saying the stuff you're saying now. He was showing it with science, etc. How much progress have you and people like him made in the last century? If we look at the world's population and the role of organic agriculture in that, what percentage of people in the world are thinking like that today, and institutions, compared with what percentage of people and institutions are supporting or apathetic, which is the same as support, or supporting corporate production of food based on chemistry and marketing technology?
Yeah, I might start crying, Alan. So we're not doing great. We're not doing great. You know, I know that you're not saying this as a criticism, but I say we try as best we can, as smart as we can be. I once got kicked out of a supermarket chain, and I got a call from somebody who was very distraught that she could no longer buy our tomatoes. And I said, I'm sorry, it really wasn't up to me. The buyer for the chain decided to drop us. And she was almost yelling at me. She said, you must be smarter. And I thought, you know, I'm being as smart as I know how to be. Maybe it was in last year's interview, or maybe it was just private conversation, probably when I was having a down moment. You said, you know, Dave, you got to remember, this is generational, because I get depressed sometimes because it feels like we're up against Goliath and we have a very small slingshot. And it's good to remember. But so your vision of how we might have a different way of feeding ourselves, a different agriculture. So could you help an eater out and say, well, this is complicated? What do you say to them?
When you kind of wake up to like, okay, you know, I need to be part of the solution and stop being part of the problem. Like the number one thing you can do is shift your diet. It's like immediate. You can just say, I'm going to renounce participating in this machine that's ripping the world apart. It's just a disaster on the world. It's like a big part of why we're living through the 6th great extinction event. Like I can make that immediate choice. Like I can make that today and be real. You know, there's a lot of things that are difficult to have real personal agency about. This is an immediate thing that we can immediately do. And yeah, and I think that, you know, it's disappointing that choice isn't happening as fast as it could be. But, you know, I used to be very unconscious and laugh at people who were, you know, thinking about, you know, the plight of animals and you know, who cares about, you know, I mean, I used to have that mindset of like just not caring. And so, you know, I wasn't a bad person. I just like didn't, whatever. So just recognizing that, and that, you know, I had the good fortune of meeting some good people at the right time in my life that kind of like helped me kind of start to see things in a different way, and that it's a process, and that, you know, we just got to create a world where just as more and more of us kind of turn on to the truth of like what our diet and agriculture need to transition to help people connect that, you know, collapse the distance. And that, I mean, unfortunately, people are disconnected from where food comes from, disconnected from nature generally, and it's a big part of the problem, and we need to reconnect them.
I mean, the easy thing is to go, look at what's happening, this is wrong. The hard thing is to say, I wonder what we could do about it. And, you know, it's not like you should have the answer to this, but I think that we're all wondering and almost desperate. People are truly, truly hungry to find a meaningful path that they could build the world that they want to live in. And people are scared. And, you know, a lot of people feel broke, a lot of people feel poor, but a lot of people feel threatened and in danger. So tell me your thoughts about, I don't know if we want to call it an anti-monopoly movement or a pro-democracy movement. I think they're the same things, right?
Yes, they are. So we are in the third year of the descendants of a real anti-monopoly movement having power in this country. And it can be hard to see depending on where you are, but a former agriculture reporter who wrote about both problems with Monsanto and chicken farming became a law professor, and now runs the Federal Trade Commission. And so this is Chair Lena Khan. Now, you may think, she's not touching my life. I hear she wins some case. That seems very technical and distant. I will tell you who does not think it is technical and distant. The Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal has written an op-ed against Lena Khan 100 times as of today, since she took office. The financial elites who want to say that we have a competitive market, but really are controlling. They're sitting atop a market. They currently have both wealth and power. They know how threatening this is. And I say this because it is not simply a technical matter. Lena Khan's success in starting to challenge mergers, actually blocking those mergers, changing the vision of what our economic policy is a core attack on this top-down capital controls, people don't matter model. And there is nothing that capital would like better than for the rest of us to sit back and say, too complicated, antitrust, these are technical, doesn't affect me. There's nothing they want more than to say doesn't matter. It matters. It really matters. So just understand that this could be a 60-year fight. I'm sorry, but and it matters. It doesn't only matter if you win in 5 years.
Yeah.
No, and you're shaking your head. Why?
Sorry.
You should be rude. Come on, well, let's be real. What?
There's one word that defines the problem, and it's money. And all of our elected representatives, with very few exceptions, Tester, Higley, are owned by money. They're not owned by the people who vote for them. The only example that's going to work is somebody in your group said, we're the resistance now. And we can only wear them down by wearing down the establishment. And the idea that appointees at the Department of Agriculture are going to help us win is to be admirable but fantastic. The only thing we can do is educate people and encourage them to buy good food.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay.
Do that and the rest will fall apart. You talk about the government and antitrust. Albert's buying Kroger.
They're doing everything they can to stop it.
They're not stopping it, and you know it.
But the way we get, this is a really important conversation. I think the way that we get the new laws, if they don't stop it, because the FTC wants to stop it, if they don't stop it, that gives us the proof. So this is a really important conversation. So what I believe is that I believe we should absolutely vote with our feet. Whatever you want to, go, and that matters. And I believe that will never be sufficient, that it has to be political. And so the political story is not sitting and asking nicely and then going away. But it is going to Pat and saying, you write the letter to Vilsack. And if the letter isn't written, that group of four then has that story. You walk through, you show what is not happening, and then you work on the anti-monopoly movement by building with the local pharmacists who are no longer able to survive.
There are none left.
Well, there's none in Columbia County. Yeah.
When I moved to Massachusetts from abroad, there were 379 local pharmacists. There's now 19. 19 family-owned businesses.
And those pharmacists are mad. And so when you join pharmacists, I'm not willing to
They're
give up.
They're not mad. They're looking for the next payday to sell it to CVS or Walgreens.
So
because that's their only choice, not because they want to.
No, right, exactly.
That's their
right,
only
yeah.
choice.
Yeah, no.
So
yeah.
I write to, I'm from Massachusetts, I live in Massachusetts now. I lived abroad for 23 years. People ask me why I came back. I said, I miss America. I said, I still do. Yeah. Okay. This system is so effed up, it's not real. And I write we have two senators that I rate pretty highly, Markey and Elizabeth Warren. And my local congressman's okay. They don't answer me anymore. And I'm not even rude to them like I am being to you. They don't answer me anymore because there's nothing they can do about the problems that I bring to their attention. There's nothing they can do about education. There's nothing they can do about gun safety. There's nothing they can do about food safety. There's nothing they can do about extortive rights and commercial practices by everybody. By the banks, the telephone companies. These are all regulated industries, and there's nothing they can do. And unless we're willing to start like the bad guys did with the Federalist Society 30 years ago, we don't even have a judicial system left.
Okay, so I'll just, and we can continue, but I think it's an important conversation. So who I take inspiration from are the progressive populists in the 1880s who were losing. But they did not give up, and they built a story in dissent. They built the record in dissent that later provided the foundation of the laws in the 1940s. So yes, it's a 60-year plan. It's not a 2-year plan. It's not like, and then tomorrow everything will be better. But it is actually seriously engaging as political entities and not just as consumers, which I think is absolutely essential.
I agree completely. 5 years ago, honestly, I thought, we failed so completely at government reform that I thought, well, we need to move beyond that. And I think that I still believe that, but I also think ultimately we can't abandon government. We need to create a better government. And so that's got to be part of our vision. It can't be our central vision because we'll all go out and commit suicide because, it's such a hard boulder to move. But I agree with you that if we are successful at building a real organic movement, ultimately the National Organic Program will either change or become so irrelevant as to not matter.
So farmers in the 1870s, 1880s were leading the anti-monopoly fight. And so part of what we are also recovering is the long history of anti-monopoly activism in this country and globally at this moment. That's exciting. And farmers have always been at the forefront of that.
Yeah.
Not alone, but always been central. They're absolutely central to the Granger movement, the early creation of the first federal utility, the Interstate Commerce Act and the regulation of railroads. That's farmer driven. Real creative, and creativity is important to me, and creativity is important to me as a vision of what society should look like, right? But really creative and angry movements, building some of the real crown jewels of American government.
That model of overproducing grains is breaking in front of us. The question is, what are we going to do? Are we going to put ethanol in planes? Or are we going to put animals back on the land?
Can I add 2 words to our beautiful vision that we're going to give the world to make this happen? Animals and people back on the land.
Well, that's the end of today's session. I want to thank everybody for taking time on a Sunday afternoon to come and hear all these people speak. I want to thank Jenny Prince and Brandon St. Cyr, our editors, who did such a spectacular job of assembling over 60 hours of interviews and honing that down to 3 hours. We'll see the second hour and a half on April 7th for our second session. I want to thank the many people that we interviewed this year. Of course, all of those interviews will be coming out as podcast episodes. I hope that you will see this symposium as a series of trailheads that you can then go and investigate much deeper what somebody has to say. Many voices with very informed opinions. I want to thank my partner, co-director Lindley Dixon, for doing all this work with me. This symposium was a little different. I think there were a bit fewer farmer voices than we're used to. And I think that the subject of why it is that it is so hard to find the food we want to find in the stores and to grow the food we want to grow. Why is this so hard? And I think that the reasons and the causes are beyond any single farmer. It's not something that they're doing right or wrong. It's a system that we're in. And this symposium was one of our efforts to understand that system a little bit better and see if we can try to figure out what do we do to help build the food system that we want to see. it's typical at the end of a symposium like this to offer solutions. And I have to say that we don't have obvious solutions. We have some things you can do. People come to this because they are people who act. They're people who want to work and make the world they want to live in. It is not easy to address issues of massive concentration of power in our food system in the hands of relative few. But support the Real Organic Project. Join it if you're not a friend. Make a donation. We need money to survive and to do the work that we're doing. When you get food, to quote Kristen Kimball, we need activist eaters in order to have activist farmers. So make sure that you really are buying the food that you want to put in your body and supporting the farms that you want to keep alive. Politically, this is a long haul. We started the Real Organic Project because we didn't think we were going to find a political solution. And I think that was true. And I still think it's true in the short run. So for political solution, we're going to have to think a little bit longer. To quote David Bronner, we have to think generationally. That's okay. But it's good that we do this work in our communities, in our immediate neighborhoods, and our networks to actually build the food system that we want. But there'll be many people who will not be able to gain access to that local food system. And that's the work we do. And there'll be many farmers who won't be able to survive. We just heard of a grain farmer whose agreement with a major buyer had fallen through because a shipload of probably fraudulently certified grain had arrived from South America and cut the price in half on the American market. So not only is America not feeding the world, we're having trouble feeding ourselves. And that shouldn't be. We have some of the best soil in the world. We have hardworking people who want to grow that food. So I hope that you will forgive us for not making simple answers out of really complex problems, and that you'll join us again on April 7th for the next installment. And we'll be talking about the Green Revolution and biological farming and these very different systems and what will our future be. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.